Just 4 rounds to go here in the candidates tournament in London, and the pressure is on. Carlsen drew fairly quickly with Grishuk, so that left Aronian and Kramnik in the position that if they won, then they could close the gap a little bit. Let's see what's happening in Svidler against Aronian. Now we join the game after 22 moves. Aronian with black has a difficult position here. You can see that white's knight on e5 is a really superb piece, and black's bishop on c8 not so great. But black is solid enough, and he has the option sometimes to play the knight to d5. Maybe it would be a good idea to play g6 first to cover this diagonal, and then to be able to play the knight into d5. This bishop on c8 can also come out via d7 to c6. So I think black's position is still playable there. But Aronian, I mean, maybe he had half an eye on Carlsen's game that was looking like a draw from quite early on, and he lashed out with g5. Maybe he's still trying to keep winning chances here. I mean, this is an extraordinary move. Of course, the idea is if pawn takes pawn, then you undermine the support for the knight, and that's absolutely fine. Well, there's one little variation here. If you give a check and you win the bishop, and queen g4 check does not force mate on g7 because the queen blocks. So this is the rationale behind g5. You're trying to undermine the support of the knight on e5. However, it does leave black's king very exposed indeed. Svidler met fire with fire. He ignored this move and just went with c6. I mean, it's a very, very sharp move indeed. Actually, I think now Aronian would be okay if he found knight d5, which seems to force these exchanges. And in this position, I think black has enough counterplay. But okay, it's a very sharp position. But instead, Aronian, I played an extraordinary move here, b5. And I think this is the real culprit. It's funny playing g5 and then b5. This is kind of strange symmetry. b5, I think, is an absolutely terrible move because it leaves this pawn on c6 far advanced past pawn, protected by knight and rook, and now this bishop never has a chance to get to a decent square. I mean, it can still come to a6 for what's that's worth. So basically, he's just sort of left himself with a completely dead piece on c8, and from this moment on, I think Svidler played excellently. First queen e1. Now, it seems funny to come to the back rank, but the queen supports the knight on e5, so now pawn takes pawn is a threat, but also it can bounce around off the angles and come to g3 to hassle the king. So just white has a great position here. Let's see what happened. Rook d5. So Aronian's still trying to attack this knight, but queen g3 pins the pawn, and that's very nasty indeed. After this, well, I think knight g6 is probably a good move for white here, but Svidler played very simply and very calmly, actually. This next sequence of moves is just about forced. So they've reached an endgame where white is, let me see, so actually white is only a pawn up. It feels like more with these fantastic protected passed pawns on f6 and c6. And from this moment on, Svidler played very well. First of all, he secured this bishop on an excellent square e4. So that protects c6 and g2. And then made sure the king has a safe square. So that means this rook can enter the game. And now his threat is to play rook on c3 to g3 to g7 and to bring the rook in. And this bishop is completely dead. And let's see what happened. Okay, the bishop is attacked, but that's a nice move. Obviously, if that's taken, then f7, and it's a girl. So king f8, and now all white needs to do is bring the rook in, and that check on the back rank is going to, well, is fatal. So black has to play this, and again, all white needs to do is bring the rook to the back rank, and it's over. Okay, secures the pawn. I mean, this is actually terribly easy to play, and in this position, Aronian resigned. Fittingly, that bishop didn't move for the entire game. Obviously, the threat here, once the bishop moves, you just check and make a queen. Actually, that a disaster for Aronian. Really poor game from him. So that left Kramnik. Could he maybe close the gap to Carlsen? Let's take a look at his game. He was playing against Radjabov, who finds himself at the bottom of the tournament table. Kramnik had white. It was a very typical Kramnik opening, actually. He played super solidly. He's got his trademark fianchettoed bishop on g2, an active rook on b7, and you can see potentially a weak pawn on e7, maybe on a6 too. But we're a long way from talking about a substantial advantage for white. This is still a very, very tricky position indeed. By the way, I should say that this was obviously very deep preparation from Kramnik, because he was playing quite quickly, whereas Radjabov was consuming a lot of time. Now here, it's white to play. If you look at this position with the help of a computer, your computer will tell you probably that it's possible to take the pawn on e7. But I think very typically for Kramnik, he declined to play this. It's not a very human move, actually. I think Kramnik has a tremendous sense of danger. There are basically lots of loose pieces here. The rook is loose on e7. f2 is a little bit loose once the rook has moved to e1. The knight on c3 without the protection of a pawn is sometimes loose. And there are all kinds of tactics start after something like knight here, perhaps uncovering this. You can see there could be a threat to play queen c5. It's very difficult to control this position. And typically for Kramnik, he played in a far more pragmatic way. Bishop f4, very solid indeed. So this one isn't running away, neither is this one. And the rook on b7 is solidly protected by the bishop. The knight is attacked on e5, so the queen came back to e6, and that also makes way for the room makes way for the knight to come to c4, and protects the pawn on e7 as well. And again, there are tempting moves for white, maybe queen a3, but Kramnik played super solidly h3. So this takes control over g4. So again, f2 is slightly vulnerable, so that rules out any nonsense there. It gives a square for the king on h2 in case you need to move the rook off the back rank. And actually there's a specific threat here, which is to play queen e3. For example, if rook c8, which looks like a very tempting move, then you play queen e3, attacking the knight. After the knight moves, let's say, I don't know, well, it doesn't matter where, let's say here, then you double the pawns, and that's horrible. Dreadful weaknesses. So, preempting queen e3, black played knight c4. And now Kramnik advanced. Once the knight has moved away from e5, then he can play e4 without the knight hopping into d3. So now white basically has, well, one idea is to play knight d5, supported by the pawn, and sometimes play e5 to block out this bishop. So Kramnik basically takes control. He's made sure that his king is absolutely secure, and only then starts to advance. And certainly, there are no loose pieces here from white's viewpoint. Knight e5 from Radjabov, so threatening knight d3. So again, very pragmatic from Kramnik. Doesn't mind exchanging off a bishop for a knight, because that just cuts out any kind of tactics. So you can see that white has just eliminated any danger from the position, but still holds the advantage, still has some initiative here. If the knight is taken, then it's a clear pawn up. There are opposite colour bishops. Black, of course, still has drawing chances, but white can never lose this position. So rook e8 played, protecting the pawn. And now knight b4. So Kramnik finds a way to just creep into black's position. You can see the idea of what white's trying to do with knight c6, and here e5 and f4. The bishop protects the knight. That knight dominates black's rooks. It controls these squares, so the rooks can't find counterplay. And this is a really unpleasant position for black. You can see that bishop is trapped in, and white is starting to dominate. So that's what Radjabov is trying to avoid. So he played rook d7. Trading pieces obviously suits him, but knight c6 anyway. And now here, Radjabov was already running very, very short of time, and Kramnik, he plays brilliantly when his opponent's in time pressure. Here, objectively, the best move is probably rook b4, but with the idea of bringing the rook around here, and that makes things just a bit more secure here, you know, cuts out any pin. But Kramnik, he played a really clever move here. Rook b6. Now this looks very threatening indeed. Opposite the queen, looking at the a-pawn, and you still have these ideas of e5 as well. And Radjabov, you know, short of time, failed to calculate correctly. You know, when you're short of time, calculating is very, very difficult. Rook c7 is the best move, and maybe black has some chances to defend this position. But Radjabov played queen takes a2, which looks very natural. You bring your queen out of the line of the rook. You snap off a pawn. You even protect the pawn on a6. But Kramnik had prepared a brilliant answer, e5. Now, if the knight goes to h5, that wins the knight. So black has to come to d5. And now, this is what Kramnik had calculated. First of all, rook b2. I think this was the move that probably Radjabov had failed to appreciate was so strong. It's very difficult to see backwards moves. So the queen came to a4, and now bishop takes knight. Now with the queen on a2, this the queen could have come back to take, but that's why the queen was forced away first. And now the rook came back to b4, which brought the queen back to a2. Now why did this happen? Well, let's see the continuation of the game. Knight takes pawn check. If this is taken, then white forces mate, and there's no defense to queen takes bishop. So Radjabov had to play king h8, and Kramnik's the exchange up, and now just traded down to a winning endgame, and here Radjabov resigned. Well, this could be a possible continuation, and in this position this is a terribly easy technical win for white. Well, let's go back and look at, well, in this position, why did Kramnik play rook b4 and only then knight takes e7? The point is that if knight takes e7 in this position, and you give a check, black defends with the rook e8 because that's supported by the queen. That's why Kramnik had to bring the queen back to a2 before taking on e7. Brilliant game. Typical Kramnik. Deep preparation, great awareness of the harmony of his pieces, great awareness of black's counterplay and the elimination of black's counterplay, rock solid king position, and at the end, brilliant tactical awareness to trip Radjabov up. So, after 11 rounds, we have Carlsen still in the lead with 7.5. Kramnik now is only a half point behind on 7, Aronian 6.5, and Svidler 5.5. Thanks for watching.